to join me in talking about the changing mindset of business. As we know, today's emerging business leaders are working harder, smarter, and they're trying to figure out what matters to them. One thing that we're finding that many companies need is a little bit more levity and humor, and our authors are here to talk about that. I'm delighted to introduce Professor Saul Austerlitz, who is a comedy historian. This is your fifth book, Saul? Sixth book. All right, I'll get through all of them. He's written kind of a big deal. It's about the 20th anniversary of the Anchorman movies, and it is one of the funniest books that you will read this year. Sitting next to him are the co-authors, Clayton Fletcher and Steve Cody. Clayton, you may have heard on Sirius, America Laughs. And Steve, you may have seen, well, if you have seen him. Steve is the CEO of Peppercom in New York. He, too, is a stand-up guy and a stand-up comedian. And they have written about the ROI of LOL. So I'm delighted you're all here. I want to talk about both books because they do, in a very real way, cover kind of the meaning, the import, and value of comedy. Saul, you've been thinking about this for a long time. Why do you think that comedy, and in particular the Anchorman series, really captured the zeitgeist and still captures people's imagination today?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question, and I was thinking about it in particular because Anchorman is now approaching its 20th anniversary, right, which feels a little bit hard to imagine. And one of the things that I took note of is that the film comedy has really kind of shrunk in significance. We don't really have all that many big screen comedies that come out anymore. It isn't as much of a working genre as it used to be. And so Anchorman, which still feels kind of fresh to me, it still feels like a relatively new movie, is also now kind of a harbinger of a lost era of, a time where comedies were big box office hits, were part of the zeitgeist in a way that comedy, or at least film comedy, has shrunk somewhat.
You can pick a lot of things to start your class at NYU with, but you picked this. How come?
I show Anchorman to my students the first week of the class, and
I need to take this class. Is it available online, Saul?
It's not. Oh. You'll have to come in person.
Okay, all right.
It's a little bit of a challenge to the students. I think partially, I want to show them this movie because I think it's really funny. I want to show it to them also because I think it is a little bit sneaky. You watch it or you think about it and you think, oh, it's a funny movie, there's nothing more to say about it. And then I want them to start thinking about all the different tools they can bring to writing about comedy, to thinking about comedy, all the different ways you could explore Anchorman, whether it's thinking about it in the context of movies that kind of emerge from the world of Saturday Night Live, whether it's movies from this particular era, whether it's the ways in which the Anchorman uses the 1970s as a kind of comedic jumping off point, or the ways in which it's a kind of sneaky feminist biopic. And I just want to get them kind of thinking about that. Now, about half the time, I put it on and students are like, wait, what? Yeah, why is this? Why are we watching this?
Why am I watching this?
Right, exactly.
Right. But it's a connector, and comedy's a connector. When I first saw Clayton and Steve's book, I thought, this is just perfect. One of the things that Steve and Clayton have mentioned in previous appearances is this is now a thing. Comedy as part of corporate culture is really, really important. Stanford Business School has a class on it. And the book prompted me to take a look into some of the recent Gallup polling. 98% of CEOs prefer to hire a candidate with a sense of humor. 84% of those people think that somebody with a sense of humor is going to do a better job. But what really captivated me, and I want to ask both of you about this, is they started interviewing people, and they said at about age 23, the question of, have you laughed this week, and do you consider yourself funny, went right down the tubes. Steve, why is that?
Well, if I was still 23, I could answer that question. Well, there are also studies that show that up until the age of 4, we laugh 4,000 times in a month, and after the age of 40...
And Clayton still does that.
Clayton still does
Yes.
that, and after the age of 40, we laugh maybe once every month or so. So comedy, we live in a world of 24/7 negativity, and it just gets worse and worse with each passing day. And we saw a seismic change ever since 2015, but certainly since March of 2020. And all of a sudden, mental, emotional, and the individual health and well-being suddenly became paramount to the chief executive officer of any organization. So what used to be a nice to have in terms of maybe putting a smile on someone's face at the office became a must have rather, in terms of attracting and retaining the best talent. So we are now working with countless organizations, very serious ones, where they are trying to inject a little bit of humor in a sea of darkness.
Clayton, you're the chief comedy officer at Peppercom. I've never heard that, and maybe you could tell us what kind of pictures you have of Steve that he gave you that title in that office.
Facial recognition.
Okay, of course. Okay, talk about that because you have fun for a living.
Yeah.
But you're also seriously think you're a human observer. Tell us about that title, that role, and once you do that, I want to know what you think of Will Ferrell.
So, yeah. So first of all, I feel like my primary purpose as the chief comedy officer is to try to find the zeitgeist of the moment. I noticed everyone was using that word. I just wanted to join the club.
Thank you. Thank
It
you.
seemed like I wanted to chime in with
Thank you.
zeitgeist. No, I think that the original title of the ROI of LOL was actually, the working title anyway, was Laughing Through the Madness. And as I think we can all agree,
This is better.
the
Yeah,
madness
this is totally better.
is increasing day in and day out. The madness around us, I mean, depression levels, anxiety levels, stress levels, especially here in America, but actually globally, are increasing. And so now, more than ever, we need to find ways to use the skills of comedy to relieve stress, to develop deeper relationships with our coworkers, to make sure our point gets across better. I mean, there are so many benefits to doing this. And the more we've been doing this now for 15 years, Steve and I, we finally got around to writing a book about our work. But what we've learned is that there are certain things that comedians know that business people should learn.
What are they?
Like how to file for unemployment.
Of course.
Declare personal bankruptcy would be another.
Personal bankruptcy, yeah. No, there are skills, obviously, like some of them are fairly obvious, like presentation skills, right?
Right.
Like comedians know how to stand up in front of people and be hopefully engaging and charismatic and all that.
It's critical in business, and I performed stand-up for 2 years, very poorly. My motto was expect less. But I found that the skills I was learning as a comedian were making me a much better business communicator and also a much better business leader. So I thought if this could work for me, it could work for my firm as well, and it did. And then we started doing it for client organizations who were dealing with all sorts of, you name the issue, they were dealing with it. And we found that comedy was the one common denominator that could break down silos, bring people together, and help leaders become more vulnerable, authentic, transparent. There are so many business schools that are retrofitting their curricula as we speak because the new playbook for CEOs hasn't been written. Everything has changed. CEOs have to be completely different animals now, and humor and empathy and vulnerability is a key part of that toolkit.
You got to be careful with this. And Saul, you talk a little bit about this. The first script for Anchorman was crazy.
Yes, it was. It gets started in a completely different vein from what we know from the movie. And the initial impetus was Will Ferrell was flipping the channels at home one night and came across one of the A&E biography specials about the 1970s newscaster Jessica Savage.
Right.
And one of Savage's co-anchors, a newscaster named Mort Krim, was saying very offhandedly, well, it was the 1970s and we were all a bunch of male chauvinist pigs. And a light bulb, popped on over Ferrell's head and said, I think we can do something with this. But the first draft of the movie ended up being about Ron Burgundy as the main character, but a group of newscasters flying to a newscasting convention in Philadelphia, and then the plane crashes in the wilderness, and the survivors are left to resort to cannibalism, while a group of orangutans who are also on the flight have a ninja throwing stars and pick off the remaining newscasters one by one. I'm nowhere near funny enough to come up with this on my own. This is actually what the script was. So one of the messages I got was maybe tone it down a little bit.
I love that because as I wrote in the BBJ, part of this is also about tailoring your message for a business. And in this case, they were trying to get this movie funded, and they shared it with some folks. And I love how you profile this in the book. Some people said, "Yeah, that's really funny. We're not doing it."
Yeah, so they ended up bringing in Judd Apatow, who was known at the time for some of his television work, and he encouraged them to find a way to a kind of cleaner version of the script, less plane crashes, less orangutans with throwing
less
stars,
cannibalism.
less cannibalism.
Although that's intriguing.
So they ended up shopping it around, and people really liked it and responded to it. One Monday morning, they brought it to a movie studio called New Line, and they brought in actors, and the actors performed the script, and it was clear that the script was just killing. That everyone there was so enamored of it and laughing hysterically. And one of the New Line executives came up to Adam McKay, the co-writer and eventual director of the movie, and said, "That was terrific. That was the best start to a Monday I can remember in a long time. I can't remember the last time I laughed so much." And Adam McKay, not yet being fully aware of the ways of Hollywood, said, "Great, so do you think you'd be interested in working with us on this?" And the executive turned to him like he was crazy and said, "Absolutely not. We can never make a movie
I loved
like
it.
this."
Absolutely not. We won't be doing that. Clayton, guardrails around this. You go into a company. This is fraught. There are a lot of third rails that you could be touching. So what do you and Steve tell people when you say, "Hey, we're going to train you folks to do a little stand-up"? What could possibly go wrong? Or do you not give them, do you make them sign NDAs? What do you do to
Of
to
course,
put those
the lawyer wants them to sign an NDA. No, Larry, no NDA.
No?
No, but what we'll do is,
kinda bumps me out.
before we
Okay.
actually have the employees take the stage and try stand-up comedy for the first time, we give them, the guardrails. We explain there's a huge difference between doing a corporate comedy training session for the purposes of improving your corporate culture than there is to performing, at Gotham Comedy Club at midnight on a Saturday. It's not the same sensibility.
Read the room.
Read the room, exactly. And this is what comedians know how to do. Even myself as a performer, sometimes I'm asked to perform for a company. Maybe it's their holiday party or annual retreat. They want to have a comedian perform. I'm not going to do the same material on that gig as I would, after hours when everybody's, drunk and loose in the nightclub. So what we tell them is, if you're not sure that something is appropriate for this session, it's not. So when in doubt, leave it out. That's what we say.
Right.
Yes, and I would add that we conduct a lot of due diligence before we work with client organizations to understand what are the cultural guardrails, what is appropriate, what is not appropriate. So who might say something inappropriate, we speak to him or her beforehand. So we make sure that we protect the environment and make it a safe space as much as possible. So that's very, very important to what we do.
I want to talk about improv. Saul, Will Ferrell just riffed. He had some fun. Can you talk a little bit about that and his creative process, and how do you work with somebody? How do you manage somebody, keep them to a schedule when they're doing that?
Yeah, the interesting thing, so both Will Ferrell and Adam McKay come from the world of improv and sketch comedy, and the stories that I enjoyed hearing the most were the extent to which Will Ferrell was just undervalued by people, that they saw him and he just appeared to be the exact kind of guy who was going to flop. So, he got to the Groundlings in Los Angeles, and he seemed like a really nice guy and was very polite to everyone, and, everyone just thought, okay, well, at least I'll be better than that guy. Like, no doubt in their minds. And then the second he started performing, people realized, oh, wait, he actually has these incredible skills that we weren't appreciating. And the same thing happened with Ferrell at Saturday Night Live. They brought him in. He ended up coming in part because the SNL producers had come out to LA to recruit one of his co-performers, Chris Kattan, and then saw Will Ferrell and said, all right, you can try out as well. And the first week of that season of Saturday Night Live, everyone was absolutely convinced, okay, we know who the dud of this season is going to be. Will Ferrell is going nowhere. And then, of course, he proved himself to be the clear breakout star of that season and of that whole era of SNL.
Yeah, I love that description. Clayton and Steve, talk a little bit. I learned a lot from this. You talk about different styles of comedy. What's different about improv? And what are a couple of the prompts? Can you talk about yes and? I thought that was really a fun chapter.
One of the things that keeps and inhibits creativity, collaboration, and innovation is yes, but. So you go into a room and say, I really think we should do X, Y, and Z, and someone says, yeah, but. So we work with our client organizations to say yes and, to build, to accept ideas. Not every idea is a great idea, but yes and, that's not a bad idea. Maybe we could try this. Yes and. So it's about accepting each other's ideas, building upon it, and coming up with an end game.
Yeah, so in our book, we cover 3 main types of comedy, which are stand-up, improv, and sketch. So for those who might not know the difference, stand-up is a comedian usually sharing just first-person, actually true stories, 90% true stories, unless you're Hassan Minaj. Then you might be more like 50-50 on that. But typically, we tell the truth. And improv is totally different. Improv is less about truth and more about teamwork. So you're trying to build a narrative together. It's a storytelling, performance art where you are trying to be funny, but you're also trying to get from point A to point B, beginning, middle, and end, or whatever. And then sketch comedy is what you see on, Saturday Night Live or Key and Peele or any of those kind of shows where they just have like little short scenes where they kind of use the skills of improv, but they eventually get to a script and characters and plot and all those, elements that would normally be in place.
And I would argue that being in a new business presentation in a major conference room is very similar to being on stage. You have to be in the room. You have to be able to improv. You have to be able to deal with hecklers or people who are multitasking. So improvisational skills are intrinsically important to business leaders.
And teachers.
And
professors.
teachers.
So what parts of, you talk a little bit about this in the book, what parts of Anchorman, some of the gags, what hasn't aged well, and could Anchorman get made today?
I think on the whole, the movie has aged pretty well. I think that it was clear to me in looking at it again that McKay and Farrell are pretty intentional in the ways that they have the kind of misogynist humor is clearly often coming at the expense of the characters who are making the jokes.
And San Diego.
And San Diego. Yes. Little known fact that originally it was going to be Stay Classy Portland, which we'd be living in a totally different world right now.
Yes.
So I think those jokes still work pretty well. I do think that there is an undercurrent of somewhat homophobic humor that pops up from time to time, where the jokes feel a little bit less polished and a little bit less thoughtful in terms of whether you're kind of punching down. So I think that those are the jokes that haven't aged as well. In terms of whether it could be made again now, I think honestly, to me it's less a question of whether or not someone would make a movie like this, and more just changes in the business where comedies in general don't really get made to the same extent that they were.
Is it we're just so balkanized that people don't find the same things funny? And I'm going to ask Clayton and Steve that too. Are there some things that are just universally funny that could be made into comedies? Why is that, Saul, that there aren't any really great comedies recently?
Yeah, I think that comedy is still really flourishing, when it comes to stand-up, when it comes to television. There's still a tremendous amount of great comedy. We don't have any less great comedians now than we did before. Right. So I think the big change is movie-wise, and I think it has to do with a couple of factors. One is just the overwhelming focus on intellectual property, and so the only movies that get made are, the Marvel and Star Wars movies of the world, and in part that's because those movies travel really well internationally, whereas comedy,
right.
And this was true even in comedy's kind of boom times. Yeah. Comedy was mostly a domestic thing that, something that's really funny in the US, it might literally not translate in another country. People wouldn't get the joke at all. So I think those are some of the key factors. And then because of those things, there hasn't really been that succeeding generation of big comedic movie stars who have kind of succeeded that earlier generation. And so when we think about, well, who are comedy movie stars of the moment, it's still Will Ferrell, Melissa McCarthy, Ben Stiller, people who are in big hit movies 20 years ago, 25 years ago in some cases. And so that younger generation of breakout comedic performers, whether it's Phoebe Waller-Bridge or Donald Glover or people like that, have mostly ended up doing their best work or their most interesting work on TV.
Television, yeah. I mean, I feel like you make some great points there. I mean, Saul is absolutely right. I mean, that is the problem, is that the movies that are getting made are, comic books and superheroes and stuff. Also, Saturday Night Live isn't what it used to be as far as churning out characters. A lot of the funny movies from 20 years ago came from characters that were created for sketches on SNL. And even before that, you think like Wayne's World, right? That was an SNL sketch, right? A lot of movies that sort of, they were born that way. But now the SNL is so focused on sort of lampooning politicians that they don't really have like the recurring characters that we remember, like Wayne and Garth, or the church lady, or the ladies' man, or all those different characters that kind of grew into having their own movie someday. And also, a lot of those movies flopped. So something that's funny for 3 minutes might not work for 2 hours. So that was also a problem.
And I would argue that business, especially now, is embracing comedy carefully. They have to reach Gen Z. They need new ways in which to connect with Gen Z. They know Gen Zers love comedy. So how do we walk that tightrope? And certainly in the advertising world, the entire insurance category is nothing but comedy-driven TV commercials.
Yeah.
My favorite character is Mayhem with Allstate.
Yeah.
But so a lot of businesses are still embracing comedy.
And progressive.
And progressive and flow. Yeah, no question about it. But it's a very fine line.
Steve, what do you say to a company when you go in? You've got multi-generations at the company. So what works for one generation that might not work for another? And then I want to ask you, and Clayton, and Saul, what works in one place but not another? Buffalo, Austin, Detroit. Geographically, what's funny someplace that you've noticed?
It's not necessarily about funny. It's more about what do they have in common. So we play this game called 60-30-10, in which we pair off a 70-something with a 20-something, a 50-something with a 30-something, and we say, take 60 seconds, agree on a movie that you both love. Talk about it in 60 seconds.
Wow. Okay.
Now talk about it in 30 seconds. Now distill it down to 10 seconds and give it a hashtag. And they work together in a beautiful tandem, and it helps them then
really
take their
smart.
corporate narrative and say, how do we do the same thing for this major bank or this major insurance company?
And we also talk in the book about when you are dealing with different generations, you kind of have to speak the language of that generation. For example, the baby boomers or the Gen X, they don't tend to be quite as, I would say, politically correct as their millennial and Gen Z counterparts, for a wide range of reasons, but they didn't grow up with a culture that was so concerned with, is it okay to laugh? Back then, people said, well, that's a joke, I'm going to laugh. Right? So that sort of translates. So when you're dealing with a younger group, and this is why you hear comedians so often complaining about how it's hard to entertain college students on campus anymore, it's because maybe the comedian's a little older and never learned like what that audience thinks is funny. And so doing the type of training that we do, it helps you to learn what other people are going to respond well to and what they might not. And so you sort of pick and choose the material based on that.
Yeah, it's really, really fun, and it's great to read them together. So I have to ask all of you, Saul, what are you reading, watching? What are you thinking about these days? Maybe for your next book, but more importantly, what are you reading? Could be fiction, nonfiction, anything?
On the way here, I just started reading the new biography of Madonna by Mary Gabriel. It's about 800 pages long, so it is not for the faint of heart, but at least so far it's beautifully done.
Are you getting the Britney bio as well?
No, I'm more interested in Madonna. Yeah. So just FYI,
serious readers only.
Mary Gabriel is like she won the National Book Award for writing about Karl Marx. Like it's a real departure.
How do you get 800 pages out of Madonna? Well, I guess you will.
I mean, I've read 100 pages and she hasn't yet released any music. So yeah, it's very, very in depth. But so far it's beautiful. I'd also really recommend.
Did she cooperate?
Apparently not, but her brother cooperated, and so it seems like, and Mary Gabriel is like a very intensive researcher.
Okay.
And then I recently read the new novel by James McBride, The Heaven and Earth Grocery Store, which I
was that
thought
good?
was just fantastic.
Okay. Clayton, what are you reading, watching?
I'm reading a self-help book right now.
Thank
that
God. Good.
has a very
Good.
controversial title. It's called The Way of the Superior Man. And I got this book given to me as a gift.
Did Steve write
From
that?
No, I wrote The Way of the Inferior Man.
Wow. Okay.
This is what my friend said,
Right.
who gave me this book as a gift. He had finished reading it. He said, "This book changed my life. I think you're going to enjoy it." And he said, "And you, as we all know, are an inferior man, so you should
Are
probably
you feeling
benefit."
the effects already, like in the grocery store? Are you,
Yeah, I mean, I
things you
feel
can-
like I'm walking a little taller, feeling a little more confident. The book, despite its controversial title, does contain a lot of really interesting nuggets about just, how to be a good citizen of Earth. I think a lot of times people title their books in such a way to kind of catch your eye, maybe stir up some controversy, but the book itself isn't, what it might sound like. But I'm embarrassed to tell you that's what I'm halfway through right now.
Who are the comedians you like? Who are you listening to?
I mean, my favorite comedian of all time is Mitch Hedberg. I don't know how many of you are familiar with him, but to me, he's the all-time greatest. Yeah, you can clap for Mitch. He's not here. I work sometimes on tour with Jim Jeffries, and I just, he does 90 minutes every night. And whenever I'm with him, I watch the whole 90 minutes because, number one, it's different every night. And number two, I just think he's so brilliant. He's an Australian comedian. If you guys aren't familiar, I really recommend him very highly.
Wow. Terrific. Steve.
Yes.
You're always reading.
I am.
You're always thinking, always
No, I don't
creating.
know about the
What are you
thinking
reading
part.
these days?
So my other passion in life is climbing, alpine, rock, and ice climbing. And I've heard so many things about this book called The Third Man Factor, which is a survival story going back to Shackleton. And there have been so many instances in which people have been lost, either in whiteouts or in desert conditions, and they've always felt this presence that somehow brought them to safety. And I have felt that presence. I've had 2 near-death. This is my 3rd near-death tonight experience.
I was going to ask you if Clayton was involved in any of those.
Yeah. Well, ever since he's gotten his swagger back after reading that book, he is a problem for me. But The Third Man Factor is fascinating, and my daughter is forcing me to watch The Golden Bachelor. I don't know why. I don't know if you're familiar
who
with
will
this or
get the
not.
rose?
It
Right.
is trash. It is trash.
But you can't take your eyes off
I can't take
the
my
screen.
eyes off it.
Of course. All right.
Ask a quick question about a comedic movie that deals with commerce, about the Barbie movie that just came out.
Oh, great question. For folks on live stream, quick question about the Barbie movie and what you think. Saul, what are you thinking about that?
I mean, I loved it personally, and I do think one of the things that I wanted to mention was that, Barbie, I think, provides so many different things to so many different audiences, but one of the things it most definitely is a comedy. And so I thought it was fascinating to see a way in which Greta Gerwig in particular kind of smuggles in what feels like the DNA of a very traditional but wonderful comedy within this, like, again, kind of like IP, everyone's familiar with what Barbie is. And I thought that, I wonder if that is going to provide a template for a way for a comedy to kind of return to closer to the center of the cinematic landscape, or whether studios will take a different and probably worse lesson and instead just make, Uno the
More
movie.
toys.
Yeah,
More toy movies.
Yeah.
Well, more to come. The books are kind of a big deal, and the ROI of LOL. We're going to take a break now, and I hope you'll have a chance to meet with the authors, ask them your questions, and most importantly, buy the book. We will be back at 7 with Run Shake and Know What Matters.
Thanks very
Thank
much.
you.